Edward was a man haunted by the past, not his own, but the echoes of lives lived long ago. He sought solace in forgotten objects, relics that whispered of bygone eras. Each piece held a story, a fragment of a forgotten dream. Edward saw beauty in their decay, finding solace in their silence.
One chilly afternoon, my wanderlust led me to an underground market. The air hung heavy, thick with the scent of incense and old secrets. Today, I would find a treasure. Don't forget to like and subscribe our YouTube channel for more stories.
The market was a labyrinth of narrow, winding alleys, stalls overflowing with strange and wonderful objects. Edward navigated the maze, his fingers trailing over dusty relics. He paused, drawn to a dimly lit stall tucked away in a shadowy corner.
An old man sat hunched behind a table piled high with obscure trinkets. His eyes, dark and piercing, followed my every move. I felt a shiver run down my spine.
His gaze fell upon an object hidden beneath a faded velvet cloth. It was a clock, unlike any he had ever seen, crafted from dark, ancient wood.
"Be warned," he croaked. "This clock is not for the faint of heart."
I dismissed the old man's warning, attributing it to superstition.
Edward carried the clock home, his mind racing with anticipation. He couldn't wait to unravel its secrets. The wood felt strangely warm beneath his touch, as if imbued with a life of its own.
I placed the clock on the mantel in my living room, stepping back to admire my prize. The clock seemed to dominate the room, its presence both alluring and unsettling.
As he wound the clock, he noticed its intricate mechanism. The gears turned with an unnatural smoothness, their movements almost silent.
Nightfall descended, casting long shadows across the room. I could have sworn I heard a faint whisper coming from within its depths. The old man's warning echoed in my mind. What had I brought into my home?
Despite the unsettling feeling, Edward decided to ignore it. He retired to his bedroom, leaving the clock to its silent vigil in the living room. Sleep came quickly, but it was not the restful slumber he craved.
I found myself wandering through a dense, dark forest, the air thick with the scent of decay. The trees loomed over me, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out to grasp me.
He heard a whisper, faint at first, then growing louder. He stumbled through the darkness, desperate to find his way out. Edward woke with a gasp, his body bathed in sweat. The nightmare clung to him, its icy fingers refusing to release their grip.
It was just a dream.
He got out of bed and made his way to the living room. The ancient clock stood on the mantel, its dark wood gleaming faintly in the moonlight. As he approached it, he could have sworn he heard a whisper, soft and insidious, coming from within its depths. He felt an inexplicable pull towards it, a desire to unravel its secrets.
What are you trying to tell me?
Days turned into nights, and still the dreams persisted. Each night, Edward would find himself drawn back to the dark forest, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. He began to notice other strange occurrences. The clock would chime at odd hours, its sound a discordant clang that echoed through his apartment. Objects would move on their own, as if guided by an unseen hand.
This can't be happening.
The whispers followed him everywhere he went, a constant reminder of the darkness that had entered his life. He knew he had made a mistake in bringing the clock into his home. It was a conduit to something dark and sinister, something that threatened to consume him entirely. One night, the whispers took on a new form. Edward found himself no longer in the forest, but a silent observer to a tragedy. A man stood on a rooftop, silhouetted against the moonlit sky. Edward felt a strange connection to him, a sense of empathy. He watched, horrified, as the man took a step forward, plunging into the abyss.
There's no escape.
He woke with a gasp, his heart pounding in his chest. It had felt so real, the man's despair, the finality of his fall.
Why is this happening? What do you want from me?
The clock offered no answers, only the relentless passage of time and the haunting whispers of the past. The next day, Edward couldn't shake the feeling of unease.
That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the clock chime midnight. I counted each strike, my anxiety growing with every clang. 13. The clock chimed 13 times.
Sleep finally came, but it offered no escape. This time, he witnessed a car crash, the metal twisting and groaning under the force of the impact. The clock ticked ominously in the darkness, a constant reminder of the horrors it showed me. Every night the visions continued. Each death played out before him, each more gruesome than the last.
I became a prisoner in my own home, too terrified to sleep, yet unable to stay awake. I was caught in a terrifying loop, the clock feeding off my fear, tightening its grip on my sanity.
The whispers intensified, mocking him, telling him he couldn't escape. They spoke of a connection between the clock and the deaths he witnessed.
I tried everything to rid myself of the cursed object. The clock always found its way back to my living room, as if bound to me.
Edward was trapped, snared by the clock's insidious power. He tried to ignore the visions, to block out the whispers, but they were always there, lurking at the edge of his awareness.
One night, I woke from a horrific dream. The image of a burning building seared into my mind. I could still hear the screams of the trapped victims, smell the acrid smoke.
He stared at the clock, his reflection gazing back at him, a hollow-eyed stranger. The whispers swirled around him, louder than ever.
You cannot escape. You are bound to me now.
Edward, his mind teetering on the brink, clung to a single thought, understanding.
I need to know.
Driven by desperation, he delved into forgotten lore, scouring ancient texts and dusty archives. He searched for any mention of the clock, any clue to its origins. His pursuit led him to the realm of forbidden knowledge, to whispers of ancient sorcery and rituals drenched in blood.
There has to be something here.
He discovered references to a clock of dark wood, a conduit to the realm of the dead, wielded by a powerful sorcerer centuries ago.
A sorcerer.
Driven by a sliver of hope, Edward pieced together the fragments of information.
I need to find a way to stop this.
The deeper Edward delved, the more horrifying the truth became. The sorcerer, driven mad by his quest for immortality, had used the clock to bind souls to his will. He forced them to relive their deaths, their agony fueling his power. The clock became a receptacle, a prison for tormented souls, forever trapped in their final moments.
These poor souls, trapped for eternity.
The symbols etched into the clock's surface, once indecipherable, now whispered their secrets to Edward. He recognized them as ancient glyphs, each one representing a soul claimed by the clock, a life brutally cut short. The carvings pulsed faintly, as if resonating with the trapped energy within.
These symbols, they're alive, each one a soul, a life taken.
He understood now. The sorcerer's death had left the clock adrift, searching for a new master, a new conduit to feed its insatiable hunger. It had found Edward, his fascination with the past making him the perfect prey. The clock had chosen him, bound him to its legacy of pain and suffering.
I was chosen all along.
Armed with this terrible knowledge, Edward felt a surge of despair. He was not merely cursed, he was chosen, a pawn in a game played across centuries. The clock had woven its tendrils deep into his soul. He was trapped, a prisoner of the sorcerer's legacy.
There has to be a way out. There has to be.
Sleep, once a refuge, now represented a descent into a waking nightmare. Aware of the clock's true nature, Edward fought against the pull of slumber, the visions it held. But the clock's power was insidious, its grip tightening with each passing hour. He grew weaker, his resistance fading. One night, as exhaustion overwhelmed him, he felt the familiar pull of the clock's power. He closed his eyes, surrendering to the inevitable.
No, not again. I can't keep doing this.
He found himself not in the familiar forest, but face to face with the sorcerer, his eyes burning with cold, malevolent energy.
You understand now, don't you?
The sorcerer's voice echoed, a chilling whisper that seemed to seep into Edward's very bones.
The clock craves souls. It feeds on their torment, and you are the key to its power.
The sorcerer's laughter echoed through the void, a sound devoid of humor, filled with ancient malice.
You cannot escape your destiny. You are bound to the clock just as I was. You will serve its will just as I did.
No, this can't be happening. I won't let it control me.
But deep down, Edward knew the truth. The clock's power was absolute, and he was ensnared in its dark legacy.
The clock's ultimate purpose is a truth far more terrifying than you could have imagined.
The clock was not merely a prison for souls, but a weapon, a tool to unravel the fabric of reality itself.
I sought to harness its power to unleash the trapped souls upon the world, ushering in an age of darkness.
Edward, horrified, understood the weight of his situation. He wasn't just a witness to death. He was a facilitator, a shepherd guiding souls towards their doom.
With each vision, the clock grows stronger, drawing closer to its goal.
The clock's face distorts, the hands spinning wildly. The trapped souls within writhe and scream, their agony fueling the clock's growing power.
You cannot stop it. The clock will have its due, it will have its freedom, and you will be the instrument of its liberation.
Edward found himself back in his apartment, the clock ticking ominously on the mantel. His reflection in the glass seemed to mock him, a stranger marked by terror and despair. He knew the truth now, the terrible burden he carried. The clock had chosen him, and there was no escape. Days bled into a nightmarish blur. Edward, his spirit broken, succumbed to exhaustion. He no longer possessed the will to resist the clock's pull. His mind, fractured and fragile, surrendered to the encroaching darkness. He collapsed onto his bed, his body a leaden weight. His eyes fluttered closed, and he felt himself falling, tumbling into the abyss of sleep. The whispers, no longer menacing, welcomed him now, their tone laced with a chilling empathy.
The familiar sensation of falling gave way to a bone-chilling cold. Edward opened his eyes, his breath catching in his throat. He stood in a desolate wasteland, the ground beneath his feet ashen and barren. The sky above churned, a maelstrom of shadows and tortured faces. The air hung heavy, thick with the stench of decay and the bitter tang of despair. Edward trembled, his body racked with a cold he felt deep within his bones. He was no longer a witness, he was a participant in this macabre spectacle, his very presence a violation.
The whispers swirled around him, their voices a cacophony of pain and rage. Edward turned, his gaze sweeping across the horrifying panorama. The desolate landscape teemed with shadowy figures, their forms shifting and swirling like smoke in the oppressive air. He recognized them from his visions, the victims of the clock's cruel game. They drifted towards him, their eyes burning with a cold, hungry light. Their touch sent icy tendrils of fear crawling across his skin.
A figure coalesced before him, the air shimmering as it took shape. The sorcerer stood before Edward, his skeletal form draped in tattered robes. His eyes, twin pits of darkness, burned with a cold, malevolent fire.
Welcome, the sorcerer rasped, his voice a dry, rustling whisper, to your inheritance, to your destiny. He gestured towards the throng of spectral figures. These souls, they are yours now, their torment, their despair. It is all for you.
Edward reeled back, his mind rebelling against the horror unfolding before him.
No, he croaked, his voice a dry, rasping whisper. I want no part in this. He stumbled back, his gaze darting frantically for an escape.
The sorcerer's laughter echoed through the wasteland, a chilling sound devoid of mirth. You cannot escape, he hissed, his voice laced with a venomous amusement. The clock has chosen you. You are bound to it, just as I was.
The shadowy figures pressed closer, their forms flickering and swirling around Edward. He could feel their icy touch, their despair seeping into him like a poison. His vision blurred, his senses overwhelmed by the spectral onslaught.
The sorcerer stepped forward, his skeletal hand reaching out to caress Edward's cheek. Embrace your destiny, he whispered, his voice a seductive purr. Become one with the shadows. Unleash the power within the clock. Together, we will reshape this world in our image.
Edward felt himself slipping, his will crumbling under the weight of the sorcerer's power. The shadows beckoned, promising oblivion, an escape from the torment of his existence. He closed his eyes, surrendering to the inevitable. The morning light pierced through the gaps in the curtains, casting long fingers across the dusty floor. The apartment felt heavy, the air thick with an unspoken dread. The only sound was the relentless ticking of a clock. But this clock was unusually still. Its ornate hands, frozen in time, pointed to the moment life had abandoned the man.
Edward lay sprawled on the floor, his eyes staring vacantly at the ceiling. The life that had once animated his features was gone.
The clock stood sentinel over the scene. The clock had claimed another victim, but for how long? The cursed clock remained, a silent testament to the folly of man's pursuit of forbidden knowledge. Its sinister influence lived on, waiting for the next soul to ensnare. Don't forget to like and subscribe our YouTube channel for more stories.